I took the blue pill.
Welcome everyone to day 2 of Framing Law and Literature in/from the Global South. I am Hector Hoyos. I'm very pleased to introduce to you Professor Bernie Myler, who is going to do very brief intro remarks on this day 2 before receding to the foreground as the Zoom format dictates. This is a Zoom webinar. However, after the recorded portion of our meeting, we will be inviting all participants who choose to join us as panelists so we can have more of a conversation. I'll pass the mic over to Professor Bernadette Myler.
Thank you so much. And I just wanted to say how pleased I am that this panel and the panel yesterday are both happening. I think this is such a wonderful conversation to be having about a number of issues that haven't been in the foreground traditionally of law and literature scholarship, and that I think have been needing more discussion and representation within the field. So I'm really thrilled. I'm not going to provide any kind of formal introduction to the panelists, but I just want to say that we're so thrilled to have Alberto Acosta here, who furnishes a kind of practical lens on some of these matters and is a kind of constitution drafter and implementing a lot of the theoretical insights that we'll also hear about, and as well as Alyse Bertenthal from Wake Forest and Allison Bigelow from the University of Virginia. And their work all together really, kind of represents a lot of the expansion of thoughts about constitutional rights into rights of the environment, rights of indigenous people, and also even questioning the framework of rights itself. And I think that these are areas that have been really understudied so far in the realms of law and literature. And so their work is really on the forefront of breaking new ground in, not to use too much of an environmental metaphor, but breaking new ground in this arena. So I'm just so pleased to have them, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much, Bernie, for that warm introduction. I'm going to build a little bit of a bridge and tell you more about our speakers today, and then we'll get started with some pre-circulated questions in this roundtable format. Yesterday, we had Diana Esther Guzman Rodriguez, an associate professor of law from Universidad Nacional de Colombia, Lila Neri, a professor of English from Occidental College in LA, Beth Payetote, an MTL alumna, and an associate professor of Complet and Native American Studies at Berkeley, Marco Wan, who's also with us, and several of you are with us at the moment, the director of the program in Law and Literary Studies at the University of Hong Kong. One thing that emerged from our meeting yesterday was what we could describe as a toolbox to think about law and humanities in a very capacious fashion in terms of, and I'm borrowing language from yesterday, adjacency. So law next to humanities, not so much law in literature or literature as law, or all the other ways of associating these terms, but having the two counterpunctually work together, resonate, and produce something new, something that is really emerging. And what I see in your respective works that is truly distinguished and accomplished is something in that direction. So introductions could be very long with speakers as distinguished as yourselves. I'm going to keep those remarks very succinct. I just want to highlight some aspects and then maybe get the conversation going. As Bernie Myler was just mentioning, Alberto Acosta is someone who has a really distinguished trajectory in the arena of implementing and of thinking, again, on the ground, making the juridical impossible possible. And he's one of the first people to articulate the notion of extractivism, which is so influential and that circulates so much today. I will also highlight that he has been a Minister of Energy and Mines in Ecuador. He has presided the Constituent Assembly there. And he is affiliated at Flasco. That is, a really important institution, the Latin American Faculty of Social Sciences. I will mention also that Professor Alyse Bertenthal is a professor of law at Wake Forest University, having joined the faculty under COVID, as we recently heard, in the middle of a pandemic. She has clerked for Judge Richard Paez on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals and Judge Howard Matz on the U.S. District Court of the Central District of California, has worked for the ACLU and other, I'm going to go ahead and describe as frontline positions of really doing things with the law. At the same time, we had a wonderful phone conversation recently. At the same time that she thinks as a scholar of literature, giving her background in literature and in post-colonial literature at that. I will recommend folks, if you haven't seen it, in Law and Literature, Marco's journal, the wonderful article Standing Up for Trees, Rethinking Representation in a Multi-Species Context. That's an article that I would assign it on a syllabus any day of the week. Allison Bigelow is an associate professor of Spanish at the University of Virginia. And what really drew us to Professor Bigelow's work is the multi-level, sophisticated, knowledgeable account she gives of mining in the colonial period in Latin America. And so you see the connection here. It's really quite amazing to have this constellation of scholars, because when we talk about capitalist accumulation, the place where this pretty much starts is in Potosí. Jimena Briceño has also written about this, who is my co-chair in Materia. This kind of accumulation is what will result in extractivism. And then when Alberto Acosta is describing what happens later in neoliberalism, the term neo-extractivism is kind of like ready to be deployed, because you have this broader historical background. At the same time that in a different nomenclature, Professor Bigelow might be known as siglo de orista, and in Hispanic literature we talk about siglo de oro, the golden age. So as if there's nothing to that metaphor. Gold, no connection to Latin America whatsoever. Golden age specialist, great, just use that term. So I'm being a little flippant there, but just to put things into conversation. Her book, Alison Bigelow's book, is called Mining Language, Racial Thinking, Indigenous Knowledge, and the Colonial Metallurgy in the Early Modern Iberian World. It is a very lauded and awarded book. Okay, the way we've organized this conversation is Joseph Wager, Romina Weinberg, and myself, we're organizing this event together, sent our speakers some guiding questions. And the way we wanted to structure this roundtable was there is a question to each of our speakers that has to do with their contributions to these debates. And then we have a couple of general questions for all of us to address. So we're going to be hearing from our speakers individually, if you will, and then we'll get to have a chorus of voices. Having said that, as in real life or as in an in-person gathering, feel free to interject, almost cut each other off, opine, debate, because that is what will make this Zoom gathering all the more livelier. The first question that I'd like us perhaps to start would be for Allison Bigelow, for Professor Bigelow. I think the question would be, in what ways do the materialities of language and metals interact? This, of course, has to do with your previous work. And how does examining languages and metals together allow us to perhaps get out of our scholarly comfort zones? So given that we're trying to think of law and humanities from the Global South, and given what you've seen in the colonial period, what could you tell us, Allison, over, say, something like 7 minutes max?
Okay, well, thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you to everyone for being here. It's a real honor to be here. I'm speaking to you from my house in Charlottesville, Virginia, which is on the land of the Monacan Indian Nation. And thanks to the care of the Monacan people, care for our land, air, and water, my university exists today. The University of Virginia was built brick by enslaved African-American women and men. It was sustained for the first 100 years by free and enslaved African-Americans on stolen Monacan land. And it did not admit female degree-seeking students until the 1970s. So this is the institutional context that I work in and that many of us are working against, and part of the reason why it's such an honor to be in conversation with everyone tonight. When I thought about Hector's question, and thanks to Joe for pre-circulating it, my first response was, well, because what else are we going to do? So those of you who have spent any time in colonial archives, particularly in the Iberian world, you know that we face this real paradox. On the one hand, there is an abundance of documents. There is every kind of document you would ever want and maybe not want at all. And yet the documents very rarely tell us the kinds of things that we want to ask about them today. So for a long time, we've known, for instance, that the amalgamation method was practiced in Europe on a very small scale using partially processed metals that had to be pushed individually through a cheesecloth-like fabric. And then somehow in Mexico in the 1550s, miners are able to process up to 2,000 pounds of metal at once. And so we know that there's some sort of new technological idea happening around mining and the processing of metals. And we know that it happens in Mexico and we know when, but we've never been able to say concretely. This is because indigenous people are drawing on their knowledge of metals and mining and infrastructure in new ways within the Spanish Empire. And the reason we've never been able to prove anything is because we don't have the sources for it. So the sources that we have are generally written by Spaniards, often religious officials, colonial administrators, who are either somewhat blind to indigenous and African diasporic forms of knowledge production or actively trying to silence those. Very occasionally you find in a source something like, un indio me dio esta muestra, or un negro me mostró esto, like a native man gave me this sample, or an African man told me this. But that's all we have, whereas Spaniards left very thick documentation about their ideas in elaborate mining and metallurgical treatises, applications for patents, to be recognized as inventors. So the real challenge for us as historians of science and technology is to find a methodological approach that allows us to use those biased Spanish sources to tell us something about how things actually worked on the ground. And the approach that I came up with was a kind of language-based, or treating language as a material and treating material as evidence of language. If we know that we know what the documents don't tell us. So we needed ways of reading around those silences and sitting with the silence. And by analyzing the language that surrounds metals and mining, I think we're able to tell stories and to understand the history of ideas and of exchanges of knowledge in ways that a study of the materials on their own outside of their context don't always reveal. So language offers a way of putting the material into context. So I do this in a couple different ways in my book. In the section on gold mining in the Caribbean, I pair an ordenanza, a law that was passed in 1525 in Spain to change the season of gold refining in the Caribbean from a pretty safe time that made sense, November and December, to June or July, which is like peak hurricane season. And this change would really be prejudicial to gold mining and to processing, which is curious given that the aim of the Spanish Empire is to maximize gold production. And so, the question as you sit with this document is, why did the Spanish Empire agree to change? Why did they put this into law? Why did they agree to this policy? And where did this idea come from? And there's nothing really on the Spanish side that would suggest a seasonality of gold mining. But in Taino oral history, some of which are preserved in colonial sources, there's a very long tradition of thinking about golden metals as plants that have a particular season of growth and cultivation. And so by thinking about the language of the sources and the way that seasonality is informing colonial law, oral tradition, and technical reports, I was able to tentatively say, okay, I think that this law is changed because indigenous people, the Tainos of the region, are telling stories about the way that they process gold, and Spaniards are looking for ways to maximize gold production, and they think using native knowledge might be a way. So it's not that the Spanish Empire changed the season of gold refining in La Española to honor native people. They probably did it for these extractive reasons. But the fact that they did it and documented it, and that we have oral traditions documented elsewhere that we can put into dialogue, gives us a kind of method, although very rough one, for telling a story that we haven't been able to tell in the past. And that approach requires thinking of language as material and material as language, and really challenging the traditional borders between the two. So I can stop there. In other parts of the book, I have other methods of using language as material, but I think that one will do. And that will keep me within 7 minutes. So I'm excited to hear what everyone else has to say. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Allison. I'm going to pass the mic now, as it were, over to Alyse. And this, the order, by the way, in which we're progressing is just thinking of how your topics intersect. You have written about how nature can claim and express rights in the anthropocentric space of law. The question also having to do with your work would be, what role does representation play within a non-anthropocentric conception of law? Perhaps the notion of claim itself, to claim, right, as in to claim a right, might be worth exploring. Alyse, the floor is yours.
So first, I just also want to say thank you for having me. It is honor. I'm humbled to be here. I joke with my students, why do you write things? And I say it's because I have to give my mom something to read. But the honest reason is I write things so that I can be in conversation in conferences like this. This is precisely the dialogue that I want to be having, and it's just a fantastic discussion. So thank you for letting me be a part of it. I want to start, I guess, in responding to your question, commenting on the frame that's kind of explicit in your question, which is that when we think about protecting and progressing nature, we think about it doing so in terms of rights. And that frame makes sense in a world in which law, or in which we believe law to be the primary means of shaping the world as it ought to be. Assertions of rights are among the strongest tools of law. Rights are seen as more than privileges, and they command protection by the courts. So as we've grasped for ways to stop disintegration of our climate, to stop contamination of soils and rivers, to stop clear cutting of forests and poaching of endangered species, it's only natural, and I use that word intentionally, it's only natural that we've turned to law and the discourse of rights to do so. Of course, we have, by my count, 6 countries, a handful of US states that have legally recognized the rights to nature. And in general, the media, and I think a lot of scholars have celebrated these recognitions as much needed interventions in the way in which we are thinking about progressing rights of nature. There's reason to temper the enthusiasm, of course. We can all call to mind the many instances in which legal recognition of rights hasn't effectuated the change we've hoped for. And I think law and humanities scholars in particular have been particularly good at pointing out the instances and the reasons why this hasn't come to be. I think despite this, there's the argument that a rights framework can be helpful, at least discursively and symbolically, because rights not only effectuate legal change, but because they change the narrative around who or what is entitled to legal protection. When we adopt a frame of the rights of nature, we're hoping to effectuate change not just by ensuring legal protections are in place, but also by changing the narrative around what's entitled to. To say that nature has rights is to remind us that nature is valuable, it's vivacious, it's vulnerable, it's worthy of protection. But I have to say, I'm not totally sold on the rights-based frame. And I have at least three substantive critiques of it. First, as I mentioned earlier, a rights-based frame is grounded in the idea that law is powerful. It can and does reshape our world. But there are lots of reasons to doubt this power of law. I've hinted at a few, and I'll just say for now that there exists a good deal of critical legal scholarship that makes this point. I think that skepticism about the power of law is especially significant in the context of environmental issues. What we see time and again is that environmental laws fall short of doing what needs to be done to protect non-human nature. People do all sorts of damaging things that we still call legal. And I think given the most recent case at the Supreme Court, what we see happening, I think we're going to see a future that restricts rather than enlarges the potential for legal change in pretty significant ways. In contrast, we see progression somewhat in the private sphere as corporations and other private entities adopt measures to aim to reduce their carbon footprint and greenify their practices. And to the extent that the real change for protection of nature is happening through those means, rights discourses don't hold as much sway when we're thinking about these actions in the private realm. The second issue is that the discourse of rights has what I would call to be, it's poetic. It has an aesthetic quality that inspires, it delights us, it motivates us. It's beautiful, it's imaginative, it evokes feeling. The problem is it doesn't carry a whole lot of meaning, or I should say it doesn't carry a consistent meaning that can be readily applied. Because rights are a funny thing. They operate really differently depending on the source of the right and the context in which one aims to exercise it. So for example, in the US, we have a right to counsel. That right entitles us to different forms of assistance by an attorney at different stages in the criminal process, depending on whether or not we have a right pursuant to the Fifth or Sixth Amendments. So when we see courts declaring that non-human nature has rights, I don't think that actually gets us very far as a practical matter. And I want to suggest that to get us farther, we need rights to be prosaic. We need to know the criteria and the conditions under which those rights will accomplish something or not. It's kind of what Diana was referring to last night in her discussion, thinking concretely. And finally, to my mind, and most significantly, I think the problem with a rights-based frame is it amounts to what environmental philosopher Val Plumwood calls a minimal rethink of the relations between humans and non-human nature. I think it was abundantly evident in the comments of the panel last night. Rights is a very human construct. It presupposes a worldview that rights is the proper framework for thinking about relations with each other and with other things. And as scholars of the global South, I think you all recognize the presumption, the hubris inherent in this idea that better treatment follows only after one has acceded to a particular worldview, a view that understands relations between people and among humans and non-human nature as comprised of something that humans have created and recognized as rights. So what was so expressed so beautifully by the panelists last night is that we need instead a framework that forces a genuine reflection, a genuine reconfiguring of the communities beyond the human. We need to think adjacently, as Leela noted, fluidly, as Marco told us. We should find inspiration in other ways of apprehending the world, as Beth pointed out. And even, and perhaps I think most significantly, we need to think concretely, as Diana suggested. And for that, I suggest we need to think more in terms of equality than rights. We need to reimagine nature as an entity in its own right, one that can be different and unique, but still on equal footing with humans. Because once you stop seeing the protection of nature as part and parcel of furthering human interests, then in theory, we can have a real dialogue about how to accomplish what we want for nature. Of course, we have to contend with human rights. There's always a conflict once you put rights into the picture. I don't actually see that as a problem. That's what law is very good at doing. It adjudicates between rights and interests. A government interest to search versus an individual's right against unreasonable searches, a right to free speech versus the right to religious freedom. But law doesn't get to that point of dealing with the necessary adjudication unless it first recognizes that two things are more or less on equal footing. So equality, I think, has to precede rights.
Thank you very much, Alyse. And also thank you so much for keeping to the 7 minutes exemplarily. Me paso al castellano. Feel free to use the interpreting function if you'd like to listen in English. Le doy la bienvenida a Alberto Acosta, a quien creo que siguiendo con esta línea, ¿no? de discusión, le cae de perlas, ¿no? La pregunta de qué se puede hacer con relación al extractivismo desde un contexto institucional. Sería la pregunta, Alberto, y nuevamente bienvenido.
Empiezo saludándoles, deseándoles una muy buena noche. Me encuentro en Santiago de Chile acompañando un proceso sumamente interesante que tiene que ver con la construcción de una nueva constitución. Y muchos de los elementos que de una u otra manera han sido analizados y discutidos están este rato inspirándose en la imaginación. La imaginación y los derechos de la naturaleza. Fue el tema que me invitaron. Y entonces la imaginación es algo tremendamente importante. A primera vista, Es difícil imaginar que algún día la naturaleza sea sujeto de derechos, pero fue difícil imaginar en algún momento dado que los esclavos africanos tengan derechos, que los pueblos originarios tengan derechos. Ustedes me van a dar la razón, sobre todo las mujeres. Qué difícil es todavía en el mundo, en la actualidad, que las mujeres tengan derechos plenos, que la niñez tenga derechos. Y entonces, antes de abordar la pregunta de Joel, que me parece fundamental, yo quisiera rescatar la importancia que tiene la imaginación. Un señor que entiendo deben haber oído hablar de ustedes de él, Albert Einstein, era una persona que rescataba el valor y el poder de la imaginación. Hay una entrevista que le hacen en el año 1926, van a ser 100 años, en The Saturday Evening Post, casi hace 100 años, y él dice en esa entrevista larga que la imaginación es más importante que el conocimiento. El conocimiento es limitado, la imaginación circunda el mundo, está en todas partes en el mundo, es ilimitada. Entonces, me parece a mí que la primera gran tarea que tenemos este rato es recuperar la imaginación como esa fuerza para pensar otros mundos posibles, para dar paso a otros procesos. Lo fundamental es entender, por ejemplo, que no podemos seguir haciendo más de lo mismo, que es más de lo peor. Pensemos ya en clave de los extractivismos. Se cree que extraer recursos naturales, petróleo, minerales y otros recursos naturales es una cuestión que puede hacerse permanentemente, pero estamos viendo que hay límites biofísicos que no pueden ser superados si es que no queremos poner en marcha todo un proceso de desequilibrios permanentes que van a hacer cada vez más difícil la vida de los seres humanos en el planeta. No se trata solo de obtener más cantidad de ingresos por los recursos naturales que se extraen del subsuelo. Con esos recursos naturales, ¿ya? Pensemos lo que representa, por ejemplo, el oro. Aquí Allison nos habló de lo que significaba la minería en la época colonial. El oro, desde hace mucho tiempo atrás, es un mineral muy cotizado, pero extraemos oro con enormes costos socioambientales. Para extraer una onza de oro se requieren miles de toneladas de material, miles de litros de agua, los impactos ambientales son enormes. ¿Y a dónde se va la mayoría del oro? El oro que realmente utilizamos en nuestras actividades cotidianas no representa ni un 10 ni un 12% del oro que se extrae del subsuelo. Gran parte de ese oro se va para joyas, para especulación y para guardar en los subsuelos de los bancos, ¿ya? Esa es una lógica que debería hacernos a nosotros reflexionar. Es un sistema perverso, ¿ya? Estamos destrozando las bases mismas de la existencia de los seres humanos para sostener un proceso de acumulación que se nutre de la codicia, que se nutre de la búsqueda de acumulación permanente de riqueza, que no tiene ningún sentido. Entonces, una primera aproximación a los extractivismos deberíamos hacerlos desde una reflexión un poco más amplia, una reflexión que nos hace a nosotros plantear la necesidad de encontrar alternativas. Un segundo punto importante de los extractivismos es que de una u otra manera se van consolidando las sociedades de las externalidades, sociedades que viven bien, y pienso en Estados Unidos, Canadá, Europa, Japón, porque hay sociedades que viven mal. Esta relación de la explotación de recursos naturales para el bienestar de unos pocos tiene que ser entendida en ese contexto. Y ojo, yo estoy consciente que incluso en los países del sur hay grupos que viven bien porque se está explotando la naturaleza y se está explotando a las otras comunidades en sus propios países. Entonces, esta es otra lógica que también deberíamos tener en cuenta. Y tenemos entonces también que entender que no podemos seguir imaginándonos un mundo que consuma la misma cantidad de recursos naturales como en épocas anteriores. El panel de cambio climático, el IPCC, por las siglas en inglés, este espacio de Naciones Unidas, nos dice que los impactos ambientales golpean a todos los sectores de la Tierra, sean los mares, sean los ríos, sean los territorios. Todos los grupos humanos estamos afectados por el impacto ambiental. Y entonces, en esta realidad, uno, no el único, responsable de esa situación son los extractivismos. Les voy a dar una cifra que me imagino que han de haber escuchado ustedes. China, esta economía que está creciendo de una manera acelerada y que sirve de referencia para muchos países en el planeta, en 3 años, 2011, 2012, 2013, consumió 6.615 millones de toneladas de cemento. Es mucho, pero hagamos una comparación, tengamos una referencia. 6.615 millones de toneladas de cemento equivalen a más del 1.5 veces del consumo de los Estados Unidos en todo el siglo XX. Esta lógica es insostenible, ¿ya? Y es una cosa que ya se decía desde antes. Es necesario asumir los límites de la Tierra, los límites biofísicos del planeta. Un economista inglés, asesor de presidentes norteamericanos, que ya falleció, Kenneth Boulding, decía que imaginarnos un crecimiento económico permanente en un planeta con límites biofísicos es propio de locos y de economistas. Naturalmente, el asunto es más complicado cuando los economistas están locos y creen que el crecimiento económico puede ser permanente. Y eso es una realidad que nosotros tenemos que entender. Entonces, ¿a dónde quiero llegar yo con esta reflexión sobre los extractivismos? A la necesidad de replantearnos nuestros estilos de vida, a la necesidad de replantearnos el reencuentro con los otros seres humanos y el reencuentro con la naturaleza. Y para eso también sirven los derechos de la naturaleza, para tener una relación diferente. Coincido también con Alyse cuando dice que ella tiene un escepticismo sobre el poder de la ley. Yo también tengo un escepticismo sobre el poder de la ley. La ley por sí sola, una constitución por sí sola, no resuelve los problemas, pero una ley o una constitución que sea discutida por la sociedad, que sea el resultado de un proceso de participación social, puede abrir la puerta a procesos interesantes. Yo estoy ahora en Chile, soy ecuatoriano, estoy en Chile, apoyando, conociendo, aprendiendo del proceso constituyente de Chile, y veo lo difícil y complejo que es pensar en una sociedad como la chilena, la necesidad de superar los extractivismos, el extractivismo minero, el extractivismo agroexportador, pero de todas formas hay elementos que van configurando escenarios que nos permiten, nuevamente, vuelvo al principio de mi intervención, dar paso a la imaginación. Imaginémonos mundos que garanticen la vida digna de los seres humanos y de los seres no humanos. Mundos que nos permitan apropiarnos quizás de los avances tecnológicos, pero no estar subordinados al desarrollo de la tecnología que no está apuntando a mejorar las condiciones de vida de la gente, sino que está apuntando, por ejemplo, a aumentar la acumulación del capital. ¿Qué es lo que hemos visto en medio del COVID? Un proceso en el cual las grandes empresas farmacéuticas se han enriquecido aceleradamente porque se ha dado paso a otra forma de concentración de la riqueza a través de las vacunas. Y hay países donde la gente tiene la posibilidad de decir, yo no me vacuno, mientras que hay países donde la gente no tiene esa posibilidad porque ni siquiera se presenta la opción de vacunarse o no vacunarse. Entonces, yo les invito a hacer una reflexión colectiva, a compartir ideas, a compartir pensamientos y a compartir imaginaciones. La imaginación, como decía Einstein, siempre es más importante, más poderosa que el conocimiento. No niego la importancia del conocimiento, pero no podemos nosotros dejar de lado la capacidad de pensar, de soñar y de sentir otros mundos diferentes.
Muchas gracias, Alberto, también por compartirnos esa experiencia chilena tan importante a nivel mundial. Creo que si el 73 fue el comienzo de algo terrible que empezó en Chile, esperamos que el 2022 sea el comienzo de algo maravilloso que empieza también en Chile. And I'll switch to English to draw some commonalities and share some notes and findings before we have another round of answers. And everyone, please feel free to interject at any point. Let me, in the interest of thinking together, get this hypothesis on the table. What if one thing that the imagination can do, literary, filmic, artistic, and otherwise, is to maybe bring the externality into the fold, because externality is real and it's actually taught, it's learned. So when economists, and those of you who are economists know this much better than I do, run a model, they are often taught to leave things outside of the model because the model cannot be reality itself. But then what is left out of the picture often comes back to, as it were, bite your foot or something, because nature is not an externality. We are part of nature. We are animals ourselves. There's microbiome in our guts that bind us very directly with our Umwelt, with our surroundings. And so externality might be more real for economics and for the law than it needs to be for other cultural manifestation and discourses that don't think in those terms. So that's just an idea to throw out. Also, in my notes here, I am very inspired by Allison telling us how she goes from material to language and vice versa. I mean, methodologically, that's just delightful, phenomenal, very important. The kind of combination of colonial law, oral tradition, and technical sources in her book, I'm sure, at the time, led to consternation from readers who said, oh my goodness, but please, you should be talking to one of these audiences and not to all of them at the same time. And yet, because these are networks, and there I'm thinking a little bit with Bruno Latour, because these phenomena cut across the supposed nature and culture divide, you actually need a footing in different subdisciplines to make sense of the whole, because otherwise you really aren't grasping the essence of the problem. And I was also really delighted to hear from Alyse about the aspirational dimension of the rights framework. We heard that similarly from Diana yesterday. It also worries me in that I'm not a lawyer, but I see that there is this fetishistic, perhaps, but real power of the law, that when we are critical of the law, and I think we should be, I worry that for some ears, that sounds like, oh, the law then is of no relevance and anyone can do as they please. It's as if, you point at the judge's wig and you call it a wig, So I wonder, perhaps in a little, reaction, Alyse, what are the limits, right, of interrogating the law, as sympathetic as I am to doing so, right, and especially the rights framework. And then more recently, we heard Alberto, but I'll share some of my notes here. Note how these terms made their way into Alberto's presentation. Biofísico, biophysical. Very straightforward, very clear. It's not physics, it's not biology, it's biophysics, and it makes perfect sense. Or socioambiental, so socio-environmental, one could say, right? And these kinds of portmanteau, I think, are indicative of the importance of thinking always already in an interdisciplinary fashion to conduct something like, law and humanities, or even law and non-humanities research. So those are some reactions, and I know we have other questions that I'd like to circulate, but I don't know if at this point anyone would have any kind of spontaneous or off-the-cuff remark they'd like to add.
I'll jump in really quickly. And I had two. I guess one is, as you're pointing out, we need imagination to kind of bring externality into the fold. And one of the things I would take that step further and say, we need something to spark our imagination. Our imagination is necessarily limited. It is not infinite. And I think that's part of what we can think about as why that toolbox, as you put it, is so important, is that it's giving us tools in which to enlarge the imagination or expand it. Methods, like Allison is pointing out, this idea of imagining things through metals, which blows my mind, and is already expanding it. I think it's important to take Alberto's kind of celebration of the imagination and then think about how do we expand that. And I guess to that point, I'll answer your question directly about the fear of what we do when we critique law. And I will say, I'm very conscious of the fact that critique is only possible because of the particular laws that surround me and that sustain me, and because of where I am located, that this kind of critique is not possible everywhere. And so I need to acknowledge that and recognize that. Law is what makes critique possible or impossible. I guess I just want to clarify that I'm not saying that we shouldn't have law, and I'm not saying that it's not something that's desirable. I'm saying that law gives us a variety of different frames, and so we have a choice of frames. And I don't know that the rights-based framework is the appropriate frame, and that there are other frames that we can be selecting or utilizing that might get us to a place where we want to go. And we don't have to reject law to do that. I think it's absolutely right. We need law. It's a symbiotic relationship. But we need to be careful about which parts we are extracting from law in order to make that relationship function.
Thank you. Yes, Allison, please.
Para complementar, fue muy bonito escuchar lo que dijo Alberto, porque toda la idea de mi libro nació en Chile. Cuando me gradué de la universidad, empecé a enseñar clases de inglés en una mina de cobre en el norte de Chile. Y fue ahí, pues mi turno era 4x3, o sea, pasé 4 días en la mina y 3 días afuera, enseñando un día clases en Iquique y 2 días de descanso. Y a través de esta experiencia de ser una de las 7 mujeres que estaba en la mina durante mi turno, me llegó la idea de investigar un poco desde la perspectiva humanística el lenguaje de la minería. Así que pues solo quiero felicitar todo el trabajo que está haciendo, me parece fenomenal todo lo que están haciendo ahí con la Constitución, y felicidades. Y fue muy bonito así saber un poco más de esta historia.
Maravilloso, realmente. Es un privilegio tener este intercambio. Okay, and it's wonderful also we can make this work across languages. I know Maria Teresa Bigelow is very busy there working in the background. Take a breather, Maria Teresa. We have another round of questions to go. Much appreciated. So in trying to come up with a format that accommodates the Zoom reality, we proposed our panelists another question, but this time it's a question that is common to all. and of course, build on their previous research. Let me go over my notes here, as I've been taking too many of them already. So here's the big picture question, and let me unpack it for everyone here as well. Thinking about non-human rights, when is cultural production part of the solution, and when is it part of the problem? When is cultural production part of the solution? When is it part of the problem? If you would indulge a footnote here, drawing on a different time period, I am reminded of how Armando Matelart and Ariel Dorfman critiqued Donald Duck from Chile in the early 1970s under the Unidad Popular government. They claimed that Donald Duck was imperialistic. They claimed that Donald Duck was maybe a brainwashing, that I don't think would be too strong a term for them, Chileans, right, into a certain affinity with the US. And so Donald Duck in the 70s for Matelart and Dorfman was indeed part of the problem, right? So it's, we're used to saying that culture is great, the imagination we just heard is great, but what happens if sometimes culture is actually part of the problem? Specifically for non-human rights, they have a different valence in the global north than they do in the global south, because for 500 years, the flows of capital, the flows of commodities have been from the south to the north, right? We just, this is so huge that, you know, for much that globalization is supposed to be more horizontal, it's best not to forget, right, that it might be horizontal now in some ways, and yet these flows are really you know, long in the making and have many consequences. Some subtopics that our speakers may want to engage with include non-Western cosmologies and worldviews. It's very different to talk about something like Donald Duck than to talk of non-Western cultural production or non-Western's ways of living in the world. We could address, in the footsteps of yesterday's conversation, the role of the liberal subject as a juridical and philosophical construct. We could talk about specific junctures in political ecology, and of course, examples from your work are most welcome. This time around, maybe I suggest we hear from Alyse first, Alberto second, and Allison third. Sorry for constantly having to mediate. This is what Zoom has become of us. So again, Alyse, when is cultural production part of the solution of non-human rights? When is it part of the problem?
So I guess in my previous response, I talked about law as a form of cultural production. Law generates a narrative that leaves us understanding nature as somehow full of rights, but rights that are somehow subsumed by human needs and desires. So I want to focus my comments here on a different form of cultural production, because I think it's important to define what we mean by the cultural production. Here, I'm going to focus specifically on that which we find in literature. I think scholars of law and literature have long suggested that literature can be antagonistic to law. It can challenge the conceptual foundations of law by, among other things, helping us to imagine alternate realities. Literature is kind of what I was referencing when I was thinking about what do we look to expand our imagination. It gives us a way to imagine a reality that is different from law. It troubles the very outcomes of legal opinions as the only or even the best solutions. It forces us to confront the artificiality of distinctions that the law seemingly takes for granted. Distinctions between the natural and the human, the natural and the social and cultural, the great divide that Bruno Latour references. This is not to say that literature avoids, I think, the many faults of law when it comes to conceptualizing non-human nature. I think historians and eco-critics, critical theorists, among others, reveal the myriad ways in which we tend to exoticize, fetishize non-human nature. We craft it into an idealized antithesis of our most unnatural civilization. And I think as in law, this othering serves a purpose. It serves ultimately a very human purpose. In the article that Hector mentioned at the beginning, I talk about Shel Silverstein's popular children's book, The Giving Tree, the story that tells a tale of a boy who loves a tree. It supplies him with a trunk to climb and fruit to eat and wood to build. And it does so throughout his life. And the very last portrait is of the boy who's turned into an old man. And the tree is nothing more than a stump upon which he sits. And both, supposedly, is what Shel Silverstein tells us, that they're both happy. And even though this is a children's book, it's not lofty literature. I think that story serves as a great example of how literature can and does sustain representations of non-human nature as made for consumption by humans, how the rights of nature can and will be subsumed by human rights. This is a sense where I think cultural production is part of the problem. I also want to suggest that literature can and it does do more than that. And here's where it might be part of a solution. As I've talked about in this previous work, literature can give us what Richard Powers calls a good story. And that's, I think, my answer to this question, which was asked to the panelists last night of what law and literature should and can do. It should help us define a good story. And what does a good story do? A good story provides the impetus and the model for a new way of imagining relations with non-human nature. A good story exists in Powers' novel, The Overstory, which weaves together human and arboreal lives. It exists in Peter Wohllebin's The Hidden Life of Trees, which, whatever doubts we have about scientific merits, pushes us to reconsider our perceptions of trees as inanimate objects incapable of communicating. It exists in Standing Bear's memoir that Beth referenced last night, in the stories about thugs that Lila talked about. It's what I think is inherent in the concept of imagination that Alberto was discussing tonight, and in Allison's eloquent plea for reading metals alongside language. I want to be clear as I'm thinking about this idea of the good story. It's not something that's found only in fiction. Stories are told in all sorts of texts, not just law, not just novels, but texts that we refer to as literature, poetry, and novels, plays, but other things too, scientific analyses, metal even. And I think it's really important to note too, as Marco made so clear in his writing and his discussion last night, that the good story doesn't even have to be written down. There are abundant stories created through the visual medium. And just by way of example, to talk about how these stories are told in the context of thinking about nature, I've been working on a new project thinking about how we generate narratives of eco-crime and looking at mass media images and the ways in which these stories not only tell a narrative about what counts as a crime against nature, but the ways in which stories further kind of tropes that we have about crime in general, including the racialized tropes that we have about crime and criminals. And I think it's important too, engaging with the question about bringing in other cosmologies and worldviews, that when we're looking for this good story, it is really helpful to look to different cosmologies, different worldviews. But I want to also make sure we're careful of avoiding othering and fetishizing. That's too often the result of when we look beyond Western literature. And what I mean to say is look to these stories, these other stories, and appreciate them for the stories that they in fact tell, for their power to push us outside of our comfort zone, to generate a good story precisely because they reconfigure, however momentarily, our way of imagining the world and our relations to the people and things in it. And I think the value of chasing this good story is that the stories might shift what we'll call the break framework narratives. These narratives that Alberto rightly pointed out that we think that law creates, but law is only creating it within a normal way of understanding the world. I think we need to shift that normal way, that natural way of understanding the world. And the kinds of narratives that dictate how we should relate to non-human nature, whether that nature bears rights or not. And I think when those kinds of big frameworks shift, that's when I think we can start seeing a shift in the stories that law tells that we're capable of telling about law. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Alyse. Alberto, te damos la palabra.
El problema para mí es que, como economista, tengo muchas limitaciones para hablar de cuentos. Yo soy solo economista, nadie es perfecto. Y entonces eso me impide profundizar como ustedes esperarían en estos temas. Y además tengo otro problema, y muy grave, que este tipo de conversaciones deberíamos hacerlas no de forma virtual, sino presencial. Me imagino, por ejemplo, que podríamos tener inclusive una copa de buen vino chileno para poder compartir más alegremente. Me gustaría mucho conocer esas experiencias en la mina que tiene Allison. Tienen que ser apasionantes, tiene que ser algo realmente digno de escuchar. Me gustaría discutir con Alyse sobre la fuerza que tiene el derecho, la importancia que tiene el derecho, pero el riesgo de creer que las leyes y la Constitución resuelven los problemas. Yo me he hecho una pregunta. Fue muy importante, sin lugar a dudas, el hecho de que los afroamericanos hayan dejado de ser esclavos. Fue un avance en el derecho, no solo en los Estados Unidos, sino en toda nuestra América. Pero ya no son esclavos y no ha desaparecido el racismo. ¿No sirve entonces el derecho? Pregunta falsa, equivocada. Sí sirve el derecho. Lo que a mi juicio no estamos entendiendo es que el derecho es solo parte de un proceso de construcción cultural. Y esos procesos de construcción cultural son complejos, son difíciles. Me gustó muchísimo que hayan mencionado al Donald Duck, al Pato Donald. Y en Historia del Pato Donald, yo la leí de niño con mucha frecuencia, habían varios personajes, porque no era solo el Pato Donald. El Pato Donald es una suerte de personaje crítico en la familia Donald, ¿ya? Es una suerte de anarquista de la familia. El que representa la esencia de la familia es el tío MacPato, el rico, el que acumula. Pero el Pato Donald no cae en esa trampa. Y los sobrinos del Pato Donald también juegan un papel importante. Entonces, no sé en qué medida esas lecturas múltiples desde la literatura nos pueden abrir la puerta a distintas aproximaciones culturales. Claro, hay un problema en estos cuentos del Pato Donald, de Mickey Mouse, de Pluto y de todos los otros personajes de Walt Disney, que humanizan a los animales y les sacan de su entorno propio, ¿ya? Y los animales civilizados son los que pueden transmitirnos a nosotros los mensajes. Creo que eso también es parte de estas lecturas que están recogiendo un hecho muy preocupante, que los seres humanos, que asumimos ser civilizados, nos colocamos figurativamente hablando al margen de la naturaleza. La naturaleza es lo salvaje y la civilización está por otro lado. Entonces, el Pato Donald, Mickey Mouse y todos estos animales humanizados, para compartir nuestro mundo, tienen que salir del ámbito de la naturaleza. Y eso configura entonces todo un escenario a través del cual seguimos imaginándonos a la naturaleza como subordinada a los seres humanos. Yo creo que estos son también temas interesantes. Me pareció genial que hayas recordado, Alyse, la figura de Huckleberry Finn, ese niño pobre que vive allá en el sur de los Estados Unidos y que abraza un árbol, que también es otra forma de acercarnos a la naturaleza. Y enseguida me vino una figura, estoy muy sensibilizado con el tema de la discusión de los derechos de la naturaleza. ¿Le habrá influenciado? Me pregunto, no sé, solo pregunto. Esa figura de Huckleberry Finn abrazando los árboles a Christopher Stone, el abogado que defendió a los árboles secoyas gigantes de California y se preguntó que si los árboles tienen derecho a seguir de pie, a seguir existiendo. No sé, me hago esas preguntas porque la literatura nos permite a nosotros aproximarnos a esa capacidad de imaginación que tenemos los seres humanos. Y me vino igualmente, yo soy solo economista, no soy experto en literatura, no soy experto en temas de derecho, pero permanentemente me pregunto si es que las cosas siempre fueron así o tuvieron que cambiar. En esta búsqueda de los orígenes de los derechos de la naturaleza que vienen de los pueblos originarios, que hay reflexiones científicas, Lovejoy, Margulis, por ejemplo, que hay reflexiones filosóficas que podríamos encontrar en Baruch de Spinoza y muchas otras personas más, que hay reflexiones religiosas que parten desde Francisco de Asís hasta el Papa Francisco con la encíclica Laudato Si. También hay reflexiones que vienen de la literatura. Hay un libro de un escritor ítalo calvino que publica en el año 1957 una trilogía. Y uno de los libros de la trilogía es La vida de un joven que se pelea con sus padres, una familia noble en Italia, en el norte de Italia, se pelea con sus padres y vive toda su vida subido en los árboles. El varón rampante se llama en español, no sé cómo se llamará en inglés, el varón rampante. Y este joven que vive en los árboles, es una novela escrita en el año 1957 o publicada en el año 1957, tiene una conversación con Napoleón. Napoleón pasa por esa parte de Italia y él estaba en uno de los árboles. Y él le dice a Napoleón que debería pensar en incorporar en una nueva constitución los derechos a las mujeres, los derechos a la niñez y los derechos de la naturaleza. Entonces yo creo que esta capacidad de imaginación que tiene la literatura nos abre puertas para replantearnos aquellas tradiciones que creemos inamovibles. Y en su primera intervención, Allison nos dijo que es importante cambiar el orden de aproximación a las tradiciones. Yo creo que esa es una de las grandes tareas que tenemos entre manos. No hay que rechazar las tradiciones, pero hay que entenderlas en su contexto y tratar de identificar cuáles problemas de esas tradiciones podrían ser parte de esa construcción que tiene elementos negativos y cuáles podrían tener elementos positivos para las transformaciones. Me parece que esta noche me voy a quedar pensando antes de dormirme en todas estas cosas que nos abren la mente, nos permiten pensar en mundos diferentes, en cuestionar las cosas que hacemos cotidianamente. Y les agradezco y te agradezco a ti, Jo.
Maravilloso, Alberto. Vamos a darle la palabra a Allison, if you would, please, Allison.
Thanks so much. I also would love to be in person, but I am 5 months pregnant, so I wouldn't be able to have wine. So that just means we have to do this later. I'll have 2 kids under the age of 3, and we'll definitely need all the wine. Sorry, there's a fire truck going by. I took the question a little bit more literally and tried to think of one example that sort of illustrated the paradoxes of thinking about the advantages and disadvantages of cultural production. And where I landed was with the film También la lluvia. And I imagine that this might be something that many of you in the room have taught or have seen in a class. And it's the kind of film that, on the one hand, for students who are for the first time thinking about issues of indigenous movements, and yeah, it's on Netflix, which makes it super easy to teach. Water rights, land issues, political struggle, it's a really good introduction. On the other hand, it is a film in which the non-native people are the centers. I mean, the whole story revolves around them. And it's almost impossible in a class discussion because people start focusing on the protagonists to sort of bring the students back to what's happening and why it is that we're being told to focus over here on these white folks instead of what's happening with the Bolivian leaders. It's also a film, by a Spanish director and production company, and that has its own history of exploitation and what they pay the extras to make the film. And to a certain extent, depending on the class that you're teaching it in, you can teach that conflict, but it's hard to get at all of those levels, particularly if you have students who are maybe not as, this is the first time they're thinking about Latin American cultural studies or Global South cultural studies. We also watch those kinds of films on devices that are made with extractive materials produced by children, produced by women and men who are working in absolutely inhumane conditions. And so for as much as the film opens up discussion and helps students think about these things, it also is reinforcing all of the traps of extractivism. And so for me, I kind of landed there with the question, when is cultural production part of the solution and when is it part of the problem? Well, it's always both, because there's no outside of culture. We're in it, from the way that we think about it, to the language we use, to the devices that we use to communicate. There's no getting outside of it, except maybe in the space of the imagination, the space beyond language, the space beyond the body, the space beyond our own experiences. And that, I think, is really exciting. And I'm especially interested to hear what kinds of sources people are teaching in the classroom to get students to think about the role of the imagination and ways to get outside of the trap or the double bind of cultural production. And I can tell that I failed when I taught También la Lluvia in my class on literatura indígena, because I had 3 students out of 20 tell me that that was their favorite indigenous text of the semester. And it's probably not something I should admit on camera, but at the same time, it really helped me learn, okay, I've got to rethink the whole way I'm teaching this text and really frame it for them in a way that I had not done. So I'd also like to hear just the experiences of others, what cultural productions have been total failures when you've tried to teach these issues, or and what have been some of the successes. So thanks very much. Looking forward to everyone's thoughts.
Thank you, Allison, Alberto, and Alyse. I have underlined again a couple of findings here. Alyse set us out on the note of thinking of law as part of cultural production. And Allison, very interestingly, also spoke about the no outside of culture. That immanent realm, I think, is something to think more about. It dawns on me that, focalization, the thing that us literary critics called focalization, what character you're going to be following around and so on and so forth, is indeed a political problem, and it can be a political ecological problem. So you kind of need, to train in the techniques of good literary criticism sometimes to intervene. And then Alberto pointed us in the direction of a really great example, Huckleberry Finn. Alberto, please, cuando quieras. Por favor.
El ejemplo de Huckleberry Finn fue de Alyse, no mío. Pero creo que es importante seguir dándole la vuelta a estas ideas de la producción cultural. Desde cuestiones más sencillas, ya les dije, me pusieron en marcha el engranaje y comienzo a hacerle trabajar a la neurona. Entonces, me recuerdo, por ejemplo, una obra escrita que está en el cine también, que es Robinson Crusoe, ¿ya? La idea de que una persona, un individuo, puede vivir aislado y puede resolver los problemas manteniendo sus tradiciones inglesas en un ámbito hostil de la naturaleza, tratando de controlar y dominar la naturaleza sin integrarse, sin buscar una simbiosis, un equilibrio con la naturaleza. Es el hombre blanco que vive solo, individuo aislado, y eso parte de un principio fundamental que era en esa época, estamos hablando más de 100 años atrás, de recuperar el individuo en medio de una sociedad que se caracterizaba por autoritarismos. Pero me parece que también habría que darle la vuelta. Y me vino a la memoria una película que me gustó mucho, que recoge la idea de un pueblo originario que vive un tiempo con Robinson Crusoe, pero Ryder, no sé si vieron la película, con Peter O'Toole, ¿ya? Que es una película. Ryder cuenta la historia de Robinson Crusoe. Y yo creo que eso también nos lleva a estas dobles lecturas, estas dobles aproximaciones para tratar de desmistificar esas producciones culturales que están dentro de la lógica de la modernidad. El individuo en libertad, garantizando la solución de sus propias necesidades en un egoísmo absoluto, es el que va a resolver los problemas. Y exactamente eso es parte de los graves problemas que vivimos. Estamos en una situación en la cual se ha deshumanizado la humanidad. Es tan grave este asunto, y a mí eso me llama la atención, que hay países ricos como Inglaterra y como Japón, donde se ha establecido el Ministerio de la Soledad para atender esa situación de individualismo extremo. Entonces, pensando en la necesidad de transformaciones, tener reencontrar, porque hay mucho para seguir con.
Gracias, Alberto. I'd also like to point out regarding Robinson Crusoe, and we've had in the chat a comment about the quote unquote female Robinson Crusoe, Elisa Wingfield's female protagonist. This is an observation from Cynthia, I believe, or from Allison. It's a little hard for me to tell looking at the chat. Cynthia then remarks about consumerism and the new iPhone. We're gathering some questions in the Q&A, so I think it's almost time to segue into a different portion of our meeting. But before we go there, I just wanted to mention that Robinson Crusoe is the example that Karl Marx uses in Capital to articulate the notion of commodity fetishism. And I hate to do a plug of my book, Things with a History here, but I do engage with that, Alberto. I'd love to send you a copy at some point. We'll correspond, but that's also problematic because what Marx does in terms of thinking about raw material, which is a concept that is very real for economists, is also a bit of an ecological calamity, right? When you start seeing things as raw material. That might be a conversation for a different moment, perhaps. I don't know, Joe, if you'd like to add a question. You've been organizing this, spearheading it. I don't know if you'd like to add a question. Same, Romina, Jimena, Cristal, Joe. Okay, so I see that as a pass. Jimena, your mic is on.
Yeah, well, I want to start by thanking everyone because it has been really fascinating to hear you and to learn from you. I was trying to put my thoughts together, but I'm not sure it's gonna come out so articulate. So I'll just try and make the best of it. I wonder if there is a way in which because I agree with Allison, and I think she puts it so beautifully in that there would be no externality when we're discussing cultural production, because from where can we position ourselves, right? But at the same time, externality has been a term of the discussion. And I was wondering if there is a way in which we could discuss how these forms of adjacency, I think it was the term that we used from yesterday, or this living in relationship that we imagine when we imagine the assemblages from cultural nature, can be thought of in terms of power. When we discuss literature and law together, we're trying to figure out how, and these are terms from yesterday as well, there is I think Heian talked about parsimoniously in law, and literature is supposed to be more vibrant or powerful, to bring my example. So my term, sorry. So I'm thinking of in terms of power, constituent power, destituent power, and these are terms, of course, from Agamben, and maybe not, possible to bring in his terms tonight. But in the conversation, if we could go back to this idea of a contest of power, right, between law and literature, and the possibilities to produce culturally a way to illuminate more this inequality of power that we see when we're trying to think of the externalities that are in that produce or that allow for the economic inequalities or social inequalities. I wonder if we could put more. I'm sorry. I feel like I'm going in circles right now, but I'm trying to ask you to talk more about difference in power when we are trying to or positions of power when we go into these examples. I'm not sure if I'm making myself clear, because I feel I lost my train of thought. But I'm just thinking that the problem with the rights of nature, to my mind, bring about the problem of once you have changed the law, there is a constitute power that is going to come in place, and it's going to repeat the same dialects of violence that we have seen before. And I'm thinking with Benjamin. So how to break that is the question, right? Do we need to bring in another constitute power through law, or is there another way? Not only, we go into forms of imagination, but more putting pressure on this power of law. I'll leave it there, because I think I just didn't make it so clear. I'm sorry.
I'll just say I really appreciate you working through and articulating that, because we were seeing the synapses forming, we were seeing the neurons firing, and that I actually think is a really exciting thing, and I'm enjoying thinking along with you, and I actually am enjoying the travels that you brought us on. I actually think it's a really good question, and I actually think it's a good question because it points us to two things, which is one of the things that can sometimes be frustrating about these conversations is it's easy to critique. It is easy to talk in abstract terms. And then the inevitable question is, so what do we do differently? And so what alternative is there? And I actually think that's an incredibly important question to ask. And it's something that strengthens the critique that we're trying to make. I think the constituent, I think your bigger question about how we change or how we deal with what we see as a constituent power, both of law and other forms of cultural production. I mean, it is a constituent power, and let's not kid ourselves. They all have constitutive powers. I wonder. I'm fascinated by this idea about there's no externality, and I don't know if there might be an answer in that. I think part of the power derives from the ability to make us see externalities. And part of the power derives from the ability to say, here is here and there is there. And I wonder if in some ways disrupting that power is being able to reconfigure those boundaries between here and there. And I don't think you have to meet whatever is doing the constituting with equivalent constituting. If it's a law that's constituting that way, you don't necessarily meet it with a law. And in fact, I can think of some clear examples even from recent constitutional law in the U.S. A good example is gay rights, for example. That law is saying, here's the families, here are the people who have particular rights, there are the people that don't. And the way that constitution is met is not through law, but through a broader narrative about who actually who families are, and that I think that narrative is coming from lots of different areas in law, but it meets law somehow, and I think it's interesting to think about the spaces in which it meets the law. Where are those spaces? But somehow it's meeting it there, and it is pushing it, and it is changing the boundaries between here and there. That's just me thinking aloud. I think it's a great question, and I really appreciate the way in which you thought through it and talked through it. I think it's something that's really good to think with.
Let me interject as a timekeeper here, because I know it is late in Santiago de Chile. One thing, Jimena, that your observation brought to mind is we've been biased towards construction, towards building, constituting, right? And it's great because that's what Alberto is doing, right? He's constituting, literally. But there's space for critique and deconstituting, undoing. It's not all doing. Doing is important, but there's so much undoing that needs to happen. On that note, let me ask Joe if you wouldn't mind pressing the stop recording button for us.